Today, we're diving deep into something so fundamental to human experience that we barely notice it. Language. We use it every moment we're interacting with the world and each other, but what is this incredible system, really? How does it actually work?
It feels invisible precisely because it's everywhere, doesn't it? And for this deep dive, we're drawing insights from a real cornerstone of modern linguistics, Leonard Bloomfield's book, Language. It came out in 1933 with a slightly tweaked British version a year later, and this wasn't just, another book about language. It was a serious, systematic attempt to lay out the science of language, make it accessible, but also establish a really rigorous descriptive approach.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack Bloomfield's big ideas from this source.
Yeah.
We want to get beyond just using language to actually understanding its structure, how it functions, the surprising rules behind it all, pulling out those core concepts, those moments where you go, aha, so that's how it works.
Exactly. And the book itself reflects these huge leaps forward in language study that happened, late 19th, early 20th century. Bloomfield was trying to synthesize all that progress. He wanted to present linguistics as, a mature science based firmly on observable facts about how people actually speak.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Bloomfield kicks things off with a really basic but actually profound question. Why bother studying language scientifically at all? I mean, we all speak at least one language natively, right? We pick it up as kids without formal lessons, use it pretty effortlessly. So why the intense scientific effort?
Well, as he points out, even though it's so everyday, language is maybe the most distinctively human thing about us. It's absolutely central. Think about education, complex thought, passing down culture, history. It's all tied up with language. But most of us, we operate with a pretty surface-level grasp of how it functions, often not even accurate. So linguistics, the scientific study, it tries to build a precise understanding based on observation, analysis, moving past just common sense ideas.
And the source is clear that this scientific angle is relatively new, historically speaking. People have pondered language for ages, sure. But linguistics as a distinct systematic science, that's really a product of the century or so leading up to Bloomfield's time.
Exactly. Before that, you had discussions that were more, philosophical or practical. The ancient Greeks, for instance, they had big debates about the nature of words. Was the link between a sound, like dog, and the meaning dog somehow natural, like inherent, maybe imitative? Or was it purely conventional, just an arbitrary agreement within a community? Plato gets into this in the Cratylus dialogue.
Interesting. So asking fundamental questions, but maybe not always with hard data.
Right. Even someone like Herodotus, the historian, did this sort of early proto-experiment trying to find the oldest language by observing kids supposedly raised in isolation. Fun idea, but, maybe not the most rigorous method.
So speculation gave way to more practical concerns later on.
In antiquity and the Middle Ages, the focus shifted more towards grammar and etymology. This was often driven by education, studying classical texts like Latin and Greek. And Latin grammar became this kind of universal model. People tried to analyze all languages through that Latin lens, even if the structures were totally different.
The prescriptive approach, telling people how they should talk based on these old models.
Exactly. That dominated for a very long time, dictating correctness rather than describing reality.
But then things started to shift with more global exploration.
Yes, the Renaissance, the age of discovery. Europeans encountered this huge diversity of languages around the world. That exposure was absolutely key. But the real scientific breakthrough came later, 18th, 19th centuries. That's when comparative philology really took off. Scholars started comparing languages systematically, not just collecting curiosities, but looking for patterns. They noticed these striking regular similarities in basic words and grammar structures across languages that, on the surface, seemed totally unrelated.
Which led to the idea of language families like Indo-European connecting languages all the way from India to Europe.
Precisely. And by comparing these related languages rigorously, they started finding regular patterns of change, how sounds shifted over time.
That sounds like a huge leap. Not just similarities, but predictable changes.
Absolutely revolutionary. Discovering these systematic sound correspondences, that a certain sound in the ancestor language regularly became this sound in one daughter language and that sound in another, was massive. It showed language change wasn't just random decay, which was a common older view. It followed predictable paths.
So that rigorous comparison, based on tons of evidence from different languages, that's what really built the foundation for modern linguistics.
Yes, that's the heart of it. It marked a definitive shift, away from prescribing how you ought to speak towards describing how people actually do speak in all its variety.
That's such a crucial distinction. The linguist isn't the grammar police, but more like a biologist observing an ecosystem.
Well put. And the source points out that even in the 1930s, when Bloomfield was writing, this scientific descriptive view was still pushing against the older traditional grammar teaching in schools, the kind based on Latin models, focusing on rules that often didn't match how people really talked.
So Bloomfield's book was part of that movement, trying to bring this modern understanding to a wider audience.
Exactly, revealing those deep-rooted things about language, as the source puts it, that usually fly under the radar in everyday life.
And it's grounded in reality, right down to the nuts and bolts. Like, the source mentions differences in phonetic symbols between the American and British editions of the book.
Yeah, that little detail highlights something important. The need for precise tools to capture speech sounds accurately. Because sounds do vary. Transcription isn't just spelling, it's trying to represent the actual phonetics. And the conventions for doing that need to be clear. It's a core part of descriptive work.
Okay, so we have the why study language scientifically and how that approach emerged. Now, how does this system actually work when we use it? How do we interact using language?
Bloomfield tackles this by putting language inside a broader picture of human behavior. He uses a simplified model, the stimulus reaction or SR framework.
Yeah.
The basic idea is that language acts as this vital go-between.
Right, this is where the famous Jill and the apple story comes in. I remember reading about that.
Yes, it's simple, but it illustrates the point really well. So imagine Jill is hungry. Seeing an apple, or just the feeling of hunger itself, that's the stimulus S. Now, if she were alone, her reaction R might just be to grab the apple, simple SR. But if Jack's there, she can use language. Her hunger, S, leads her to speak, I want an apple, or whatever. That speech is her linguistic reaction, which Bloomfield labels R.
Okay, so her speaking is a reaction R, and then her words become the stimulus for Jack.
Exactly. Jack hears her words. For him, that's the stimulus S. And his reaction R is to actually get the apple for her. So instead of a direct SR, Jill sees apple, Jill takes apple, language creates this indirect path. S, Jill's hunger, des R, Jill's speech, des, Jack hears speech, dis R, Jack gets apple.
Ah, okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The source diagrams this as SRSR. That little R, Jill's speech, it's like a substitute reaction, isn't it? Instead of acting directly, she speaks. And that speech itself then becomes the stimulus S for Jack, triggering his reaction R. Language slots right into the middle of the behavioral chain.
It's the fundamental way we cooperate using language. It's incredibly powerful. One person makes sounds, and those sounds trigger a learned, coordinated action in someone else. This shared coordination is everything. And the source distinguishes this practical reaction, Jack getting the apple, from a purely linguistic one. Like if Jack just said, okay, in response, that would be his R, potentially becoming another S for Jill, maybe leading to more talk.
So it breaks down communication into these observable steps. Speaker stimulus, speaker linguistic reaction, sound waves bridging the gap, listener stimulus, listener reaction.
Yes. The physical gap between Jill's internal state and Jack's action is bridged by those sound waves carrying a coded signal. And the source really hammers this home, this whole SRSR chain, this mediation via language. It only works because, within their speech community, there's a shared conventional link, a fundamental coordination between certain sounds, I want an apple, and certain meanings or situations, and crucially, the typical responses or actions associated with them.
That shared understanding is what makes Jill's sounds reliably prompt Jack's action. Connect back to you listening. Think about the last time you asked for something. Ordering coffee. Your words were the stimulus. S for the barista's action. R, asking for directions. Same thing, negotiating plans. That's a whole back and forth of SR-SR sequences. This simple model really gets at the core function of language in coordinating what we do together.
And the source briefly touches on how this learning starts super early. Children acquire language by connecting the speech they hear with the situations they observe. The example given is a child learning, Daddy brought it. They hear that phrase repeatedly when Daddy brings something. The visual stimulus, Daddy bringing, gets paired with the auditory stimulus, Daddy brought it. Gradually, the child learns to associate that sound sequence with that kind of event, and eventually to produce it themselves.
So, from this perspective, language learning is a kind of powerful behavioral conditioning. Hearing sounds, seeing context, learning to make the sounds, to get results or join in.
Yes, it's learned and reinforced through these cycles. Stimulus, linguistic response, stimulus for listener's reaction. That's how the system is maintained.
Okay, so language mediates behavior through shared sound meaning links. And this system lives and breathes within groups of people who talk to each other, these speech communities.
Exactly. Which brings us to Chapter 3 and the concept of the speech community. The source defines it pretty straightforwardly. A group of people who interact using speech. It's the interaction, the communication network that defines it, not necessarily just geography or politics, though those often play a role, of course.
But what's really striking is that even inside one community, people don't all talk the same way, right? The source emphasizes a lot of variation.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Language is never perfectly uniform within a community. You get differences based on all sorts of factors: social class, job, education level, age, gender, and especially in larger communities where you live geographically. The source talks about the difference between good or standard speech, often linked to education or prestige groups, and vulgar or non-standard speech, which might have different social baggage, but linguistically it's just as systematic and rule-governed.
So standard is often more about social perception than some inherent linguistic correctness.
That's a key insight from descriptive linguistics, yes. The source also gives examples of occupational groups developing their own jargon or ways of speaking. Think doctors, lawyers, tech workers, gamers. They have specialized vocabulary and maybe even pronunciation quirks tied to their shared activities. Outsiders might not understand it easily.
And it mentions even finer variations, like pronunciation differences within a single city. It uses Chicago English as an example. Different ways people might say vowels in words like half, dance, or ant, depending on their background within that city.
Exactly. So what stands out to you? Think about your own interactions. Do you hear subtle differences in how people talk? Family versus colleagues, older versus younger people.
People from different neighborhoods, maybe. These aren't mistakes. There's structured variations signaling social or regional identity within the larger community.
And geography is obviously a huge factor in this variation. That's where dialects come in.
Dialects being regional varieties.
Yes. They differ systematically, maybe in pronunciation or vocabulary or grammar rules. Linguists map these differences using something called isoglosses. Imagine drawing lines on a map. An isogloss marks the boundary where a particular linguistic feature changes. Like, this side of the line people say bucket, that side they say pail.
The source mentions maps for big language areas like French or German, showing how these isogloss lines for different features often bundle together, defining dialect regions.
Right, and these boundaries might follow natural barriers like rivers or mountains or old political borders, but sometimes they cut right across them, showing complex histories of settlement and contact. The example for French shows how different words for very, like bien, molto, mucho, are used in areas bordering Italy or Spain, reflecting that influence. The isoglosses map it out.
Okay, but here's a crucial point the source makes. Usually, speakers of different dialects within the same broad language area, like English or German, can still understand each other, maybe with a bit of effort.
Yes, that's key. The real communication barrier happens when you have speakers from truly different speech communities, where the languages are mutually unintelligible. The source contrasts understanding, say, different British and American English dialects, usually possible, with the German speaker trying to understand a Danish speaker. Even though German and Danish are historically related, the systems have diverged so much that understanding isn't automatic. It's a different level of difference.
And the lines aren't always sharp, are they? Between dialects or even languages?
No. The source notes that boundaries can be fuzzy. You can have dialect continua, especially across border areas. Differences might accumulate gradually from one town to the next. People in adjacent villages understand each other fine, but speakers from opposite ends of the continuum might not. There's no single sharp break point.
It really shows how language and dialect are complex, fluid concepts tied to social interaction and history, not just neat lines on a map.
Absolutely. Speech communities are dynamic, defined by communication patterns and the linguistic systems that enable them, variations and all.
Okay, moving from the social context, let's zoom right down to the physical level, the sounds themselves. What are the absolute basic building blocks of sound that actually matter for meaning?
Right. This gets us to a really central concept in structural linguistics, the phoneme. This is covered in Chapter 5. A phoneme isn't just any old sound we can make. Its definition is based on its job within a specific language's system. It's the smallest unit of sound that can actually change the meaning of a word in that language, the minimal distinctive unit.
So it's less about the precise physical sound and more about its function in creating contrast.
Exactly. Though let's quickly touch on the physical side, as the source does. Speech sounds are physical events. Vibrations traveling through the air. We make them with our vocal organs. Air from the lungs gets shaped by the larynx. That's where the vocal cords are. They vibrate for voiced sounds like B or Z, but not for voiceless ones like P or S. Then the airflow is modified further by the tongue, lips, teeth, the roof of the mouth. Different positions and movements create different sounds. Vowels involve a relatively open tract. Consonants involve some kind of obstruction or narrowing.
And we can make a huge variety of these physical sounds.
An almost infinite variety, technically. But, and this is crucial, each language cherry-picks a specific, limited set of sounds that it uses to distinguish meanings. These are the phonemes of that language. Slight variations in pronunciation that don't change meaning in a given language, those are just different ways of saying the same phone. They're called allophones.
Could you give an example of allophones?
Sure. Think about the P sound in English. In a word like pet, at the beginning, we usually say it with a little puff of air. Afterwards, it's aspirated PB. But in spat, after the S, there's no puff of air. It's unaspirated P. Physically different sounds. But in English, swapping them doesn't change the word's meaning. So PB and P are just two allophones of the single English phone P.
Ah, okay. But in another language, that puff of air might actually make a difference.
Exactly. In some languages, like Thai or Hindi, aspiration is phonemic. Having the puff or not creates a different word. So in those languages, aspirated and unaspirated P would likely be separate phonemes.
So the key is whether the sound difference creates a meaning difference in that specific language. That's where minimal pairs come in handy, right?
Yes, minimal pairs are the classic test. They're pairs of words that differ by only a single sound but have different meanings. The source gives examples like pen, bin, tin. The only difference is the first sound. P, B, T. Because changing just that sound changes the word and its meaning. We know P, B, and T are distinct phonemes in English.
Or like pen versus pin. Shows that vowel in pen and the vowel in pin, are different phones too.
Precisely.
This really shows why just using our regular alphabet for transcription is tricky. Letters don't always match up one-to-one with phones, and they hide all that allophonic detail.
Right. The source flags this issue, the mismatch between spelling and sound. It points towards needing a more precise system, like the International Phonetic Alphabet, where each distinct sound ideally gets its own symbol. Vowels are especially complex. The source even includes those diagrams linguists use, plotting vowels based on tongue position, how high or low, how far front or back. It shows how sounds are described physically.
And different languages carve up that vowel space differently.
They do. The source compares English vowels to German or French, pointing out sounds that exist in one but not the others, or distinctions that matter in one language but not another.
So why is getting this phoned concept so important for you, the listener?
Because it's absolutely fundamental to pronunciation and understanding words in any language, including your own, but especially when learning a new one. You have to train your ear to hear and your mouth to produce the specific sound contrasts that are phonemic in that target language. If your native language doesn't make a distinction that the new language does make, maybe two sounds are just allophones for you, but separate phonemes for them, you'll struggle. You might mishear words or pronounce things in a way that leads to misunderstanding.
It's about mastering the system of contrast that the community uses, not just making vaguely similar sounds.
That's the core insight. Linguistic meaning at the sound level isn't about the exact physical sound wave, which varies like crazy anyway. It's about the abstract system of differences that the community implicitly agrees on. It's a contrast that distinguishes meaning.
Okay, so phonemes are the building blocks. But sounds don't just happen one by one. They flow together, and how we say them, the emphasis, the melody, also carries meaning.
Right. This brings us to what the source calls modifications, discussed in Chapter 7. These are features that overlay the basic sounds, applying to syllables, words, or whole chunks of speech. The big ones are stress and pitch.
Let's start with stress, the emphasis or prominence given to a syllable or word.
Stress is really important in English. As the source points out, sometimes where you put the stress can completely change the meaning or the grammatical role of a word. The classic example is permit. Stress the first syllable. Permit. That's the noun, the piece of paper.
Right, like a parking permit.
Exactly. But stress the second syllable. Permit. Now it's the verb, meaning to allow something.
Same spelling, same sounds basically, but the stress pattern changes everything.
It does. Stress isn't just random loudness. It's a systematic part of English word structure and sentence rhythm. The source gives phrase examples too, like, is in my parking place. The stress on parking place is pretty fixed, but you could stress my or is differently depending on what you want to emphasize in the sentence.
And then there's pitch, the musical tune of our voice.
Pitch contours, or intonation patterns over phrases and sentences, are also incredibly meaningful in English. The source gives a simple, clear example. telling apart a statement from a basic yes-no question. If I say, John run away, with my pitch falling at the end, that sounds like a statement. I'm telling you it happened.
Yeah.
But if I say, John run away, with my pitch rising at the end, now it sounds like a question. I'm asking if it happened. Same words, different pitch contour, different grammatical function.
We do this all the time without thinking about it.
We do. These intonation patterns are learned right along with the words and grammar. And different languages use pitch very differently. Some languages, like Mandarin Chinese or Thai, are tonal. Pitch changes within a syllable distinguish different words. English mostly uses pitch over larger units for grammar, focus, or attitude.
And these modifications stress pitch along with other things like how fast or loud we talk or the quality of our voice. They also add emotional flavor, right? The expressive features.
Yes, the source calls them expressive or secondary features. They convey attitude, emotion, emphasis, things that go beyond just the dictionary definition of the words. Saying, that's great, with a high, bright pitch sounds enthusiastic. Saying the exact same words in a low, flat, monotone, maybe sarcastic or bored. Huge difference in meaning conveyed.
What's really fascinating here is realizing these things aren't just random tone of voice, they're structured. Where you put stress, how your pitch moves these sonority patterns within the language system. They can change meaning, signal sentence type, convey intention. They're part of the code.
It shows how multi-layered communication is. The signal isn't just the string of phonemes, it's the phones plus these superimposed patterns.
Think about it. How much meaning do you get purely from how someone says something? This shows those hows are actually part of the language structure itself.
And mastering them is crucial for sounding natural and being fully understood in a language. It's not just about pronouncing the consonants and vowels correctly.
Okay, so from sounds and how they're modified, let's zoom out again. How do these smaller bits combine to make bigger units, like words? And how do words then combine to make sentences?
This takes us into two related areas. Morphology, which is the study of word structure, chapter 13. And syntax, the study of sentence structure, chapter 11.
Morphology first then. Building words.
Right. Some words are simple, single units, like dog or walk. But lots of words are complex. They're built from smaller pieces that carry meaning. These smallest meaningful pieces are called morphemes. A morpheme is the basic unit of meaning or grammatical function.
And you mentioned these can be free or bound.
Yes. A free morpheme can stand alone as a word itself, like book, run, happy. A bound morpheme can't stand alone. It has to be attached to another morpheme. These are usually things like prefixes and suffixes. Think ing in running or in unhappy or ins for plural books.
So a word like unhappily has three morphemes. Bound, happy, free, bound. Each bit adds something.
Exactly. And the source points out that languages vary enormously in how they use morphemes to build words. This leads to different morphological types.
What are the main types?
Well, at one extreme, you have highly analytical languages. English is pretty analytical. Words tend to be simple, and we show grammatical relationships mostly through word order and by using separate little function words like of, the, will, is. At the other extreme are highly synthetic languages. These languages pack a lot of grammatical information and meaning into single, often very long words by combining many morphemes together.
Like that Eskimo example in the source. That word was incredibly long.
It really illustrates the point, doesn't it? That one word, awisu isar si nartongna, meaning I am looking for something suitable for a fish line. It contains a root related to fish line, plus a whole string of bound morphemes indicating things like something to use for, suitable for, look for, I'm doing it, and a modifier. That's polysynthetic.
Wow, English needs a whole phrase for that.
Right. The source also gives examples from Latin and Greek. Think about Latin verb endings that tell you the tense, mood, voice, person, and number all in one little suffix. Or noun endings showing case, like subject, object, possessive. That's inflectional morphology, another type of synthesis.
So languages basically choose different strategies. Pack info into words, or spread it out using word order and extra little words.
That's a good way to put it. Now, how do these words, whether they're simple or complex, combine to form sentences? That's where syntax comes in.
Syntax, sentence structure.
Yes, the rules and patterns that govern how we arrange words and phrases to make grammatical and meaningful sentences. And just like morphology, syntax varies a lot across languages. The source emphasizes that English syntax relies very heavily on word order. Dog bites man is totally different from man bites dog. The order tells you who did what to whom.
Subject, verb, object is pretty standard for us.
It is. And other things matter too, like agreement. The verb has to agree with the subject, like he runs versus they run. That's a syntactic rule in English.
And the source mentions basic sentence patterns.
It describes some fundamental structures found widely, though the specifics vary. Things like actor-action, Sarah sings. Actor-action goal. David built a house, the house is the goal or result. Actor-action undergoer. Maria ate the pizza undergoes the action. And structures involving descriptions or attributes. Poor John slipped. The house on the hill is empty.
Okay, let's unpack this. Understanding syntax is basically understanding how we build complex ideas. We link elements together in specific relationships, and the structure of the positions signal those roles, who's doing what, what's being described.
Exactly. And the source shows how we form different sentence types using these structures, often combined with other things. Like, to make a yes-no question in English, we often change the word order, is John here? Or add do, does John live here? Plus, we use that rising pitch we talked about. For commands, we might just drop the subject, go away. Syntax provides the framework for all these different communicative jobs.
So it's the blueprint for expressing complete thoughts and intentions.
Yes, it's how we organize words into bigger, meaningful packages. The source stresses that while the specific rules differ wildly between languages, the basic function of syntax, providing a system for combining words meaningfully, seems to be universal.
Now, languages aren't frozen in time, are they? They change constantly. How do linguists figure out these changes and how languages might be related historically?
This is the realm of historical linguistics, which the source covers in chapters 18, 19, and 20. The main tool is the comparative method. Linguists carefully compare languages they suspect are related. They look for regular, systematic patterns of correspondence, especially in basic vocabulary and sounds.
And this is how they group languages into families.
Exactly. The classic example, which the source discusses, is the huge Indo-European family. By comparing core words, things like mother, father, foot, numbers, basic verbs across languages in branches like Germanic, English-German, Romance, French, Spanish, Slavic, Russian, Polish, Indo-Aryan, Hindi, Greek, Celtic, and others, they find similarities that are too regular and systematic to be just chance borrowing. English father, German Vater, Latin pater, Greek pater, Sanskrit patar, they all point back to a common ancestor word, reconstructed as something like fatar in Proto-Indo-European, spoken thousands of years ago.
The source includes tables showing these regular sound matches, right? That's the core evidence.
It does. Those correspondences are key. And it briefly mentions other major language families, too. Euro-Lataic, like Finnish, Hungarian, Turkish, Sino-Tibetan, including Chinese languages, Malayo-Polynesian, and the incredible diversity of Native American languages. The speaker numbers, even from the 1930s, give a sense of the global picture.
Chapter 19 revisits dialect geography, but with a historical lens.
Yes, it connects the two. Mapping dialect features using isoglosses doesn't just show current variation, it often reflects history. These maps can show how linguistic changes spread over time, maybe radiating out from cultural centers, or how older features got preserved in more isolated areas. The German, French, and Dutch dialect maps in the source illustrate how these patterns form over centuries, shaped by geography and human movement.
Here's where it gets really interesting. All this comparison and mapping reveals that language change isn't chaotic. It often follows regular, predictable patterns. Sounds shift in systematic ways.
Which leads directly to Chapter 20 on phonetic change, how the pronunciation system of a language evolves. The source describes systematic sound shifts. While it might not use the exact term Grimm's law, it explains the principle behind it. Those regular sound correspondences we see between related languages, they're the result of systematic sound changes that happened as the languages split off from their common ancestor. For example, explaining how certain consonants in Proto-Indo-European systematically changed in the Germanic branch. Like an ancestral T sound often became the in early Germanic, think Latin, Tress, English 3, while it stayed T in Latin.
So by tracing these regular changes backward, linguists can actually reconstruct aspects of the lost ancestor language.
Exactly. Even without written records of Proto-Indo-European itself, they can infer quite a bit about its sound system and vocabulary by comparing its descendants and applying the laws of sound change. The tables of sound correspondences in the source are the data that makes this possible.
And written records from the past help, but they aren't a perfect window onto historical speech, are they? Chapter 17.
Right. Written language often lags behind spoken language. Spelling systems can become fixed and fail to keep up with pronunciation changes over hundreds of years. Think about English spelling. So, while old texts are invaluable, linguists have to be critical and interpret them carefully to figure out how things likely sounded.
What's fascinating here is that This ability to use scientific methods, comparisons, sound laws, mapping to reconstruct language history. It's like linguistic archaeology, digging into the past of human speech, migration, and culture, using patterns in language today as clues.
It powerfully demonstrates that language is constantly evolving. Variation and change are just natural parts of its existence, not signs of things falling apart.
Okay, we've covered a lot about the how, sounds, words, sentences, history, but ultimately language is for conveying meaning. How does the scientific study, especially from Bloomfield angle, deal with something as slippery as meaning?
Meaning. Chapter 14 tackles this, and the source is refreshingly honest about how tough it is. It basically says meaning is the weakest link in linguistic science. Why? Because meaning is the bridge between language and, well, everything else. The real world, our experiences, our knowledge, the specific situation. It's incredibly vast, complex, and often subjective. Hard to pin down scientifically like you can pin down a sound pattern.
The source uses the example of apple. The meaning isn't just the dictionary definition. It's everything a speaker or listener knows and feels about apples, taste, texture, where they grow, uses, maybe personal memories. It's huge and varies between people.
Exactly. The source contrasts different takes on meaning. It mentions the mentalist view, meaning as an idea or concept in the mind. But fitting with the book's overall approach, it leans towards a more mechanistic or behaviorist perspective, trying to ground meaning in observable things. From this viewpoint, the meaning of a word or phrase is essentially the set of situations or conditions that typically cause a speaker to utter it, and the typical responses it gets from a listener.
So less about a mental idea and more about the stimulus-response connection in the real world, meaning as the link between the word and the situations it's used in.
Yes, trying to make it about observable correlations. The meaning is the connection between the linguistic form and the non-linguistic stuff it relates to, as established within the speech community. It ties back to that SR model, meaning links the speaker stimulus to the listener's reaction via the word.
Connect back to you listening. Think about a word like home. It's not just place of residence. It triggers a whole network of association-specific places, feelings of comfort or maybe discomfort, family, smells, memories. That richness illustrates why meaning is so hard to fully capture. Scientifically, it's this personal associative web.
And the source touches on different aspects of meaning, too. Beyond the basic link to an object or action denotation, words have connotations, emotional coloring, social associations. Taboo words are an extreme example. The form itself carries strong negative social meaning. Professional jargon has specialized meanings only clear to insiders, and meanings shift and extend. The example of BlackBerry, first the fruit, then the phone, shows how meanings can transfer based on analogy or association.
It really feels like meaning is where the neat system of language crashes into the messy reality of human life and culture.
It's the interface, absolutely. And the source acknowledges that, despite the difficulties, understanding meaning is vital. Language only works because its forms do connect to meaning in a reasonably stable, shared way within a community. That's what allows the coordination of behavior.
Okay, one last major piece from the source. A look at how language makes itself efficient using substitutes.
Yes, substitution, chapter 15. This is about using one linguistic form to stand in for or point back to another form or idea that's already been mentioned or is clear from the context. It's all about avoiding repetition and making language flow.
Pronouns are the obvious example.
They're the classic case. Instead of saying, my neighbor bought a new car and my neighbor is very happy with the new car, we say, my neighbor bought a new car and he is very happy with it. He substitutes for my neighbor and it substitutes for the new car. Much smoother.
So the source defines a substitute as a form whose meaning depends on the context, pointing to something else.
Exactly. Its reference isn't fixed. It gets its meaning from what it's replacing or pointing to in that specific instance. The source discusses several types. Pronouns like I, you, he, she, it, we, they. They signal grammatical info like person, speaker, hearer, other, number, sometimes gender. But who I or you refers to changes constantly depending on who's talking to whom, purely contextual. Then there are demonstratives, this, that, these, those. These often point to things in the physical situation. Pass me that book, pointing. This is often closer, that further away. So they can point back to ideas in the conversation, right? Like, I agree with that, where that means the point you just made. Precisely, substituting for a whole chunk of previous discourse. And interrogative words, too, like who, what, where? Yes, they function as substitutes for the information the question is asking for. In who left, who stands in for the unknown person's identity. It's a placeholder for the answer.
What stands out to you? Just think how often you use tiny words like he, she, it, this, that. They seem insignificant, but communication would grind to a halt without them. They're doing so much work, relying entirely on shared understanding of the context to make sense.
They're essential for creating coherent text and conversation. The source does note that substitution systems can get quite complex and work differently in different languages, but the basic principle using forms as pointers or replacements is a really common strategy for linguistic efficiency.
Wow. Okay, we have really gone deep today, using Leonard Bloomfield's classic work as our map to explore the nuts and bolts of language. We started with why study it scientifically at all, moving past common sense to descriptive observation. We saw how language works in action, mediating behavior through that SR model, like with Jill and the apple.
We looked at language and its social home speech communities with all their internal variations, dialects, standard versus non-standard forms mapped by things like isoglosses. Then we dove right down to the sounds, the phonemes, not just noise, but minimal units of contrast that create meaning, and how stress and pitch modify those sounds.
Then built back up. How sounds make morphemes. Morphemes make words, morphology, and words make sentences, syntax. We saw the amazing diversity in how languages structure things, from analytical to highly synthetic. We journeyed into language history, using the comparative method and sound change patterns to see how languages are related and how they evolve, linguistic archaeology.
And we wrestled with the challenge of meaning how language connects to the world and our experience before looking at the clever efficiency of substitution, using words like pronouns as shortcuts.
So the big takeaways from this deep dive seem to be language is this incredibly complex, yet systematic, dynamic system. It uses arbitrary signs, mainly sounds, that a community shares to coordinate what they do.
And studying it scientifically means meticulous description of how it actually works, not judging it. Variation and change, totally normal, inherent parts of the system.
And while meaning is fuzzy around the edges, the whole system hinges on those shared conventions, linking forms to meanings, allowing us to communicate and cooperate.
Absolutely. Understanding language really pulls together insights from phonetics, grammar, history, sociology, psychology. It's inherently interdisciplinary.
Bloomfield's goal, the source says, was to contribute to understanding human speech. Now, given how totally fundamental language is to us, it shapes our thoughts, our learning, our societies, maybe even our perception. What is this deep scientific look at its structure, from the tiniest sound contrast to the flow of sentences, ultimately tell us about being human? How does knowing about phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and systematic change affect how you think about your next conversation, the words you choose, or even just the voice inside your head?
It really highlights that language isn't just a tool we picked up. It seems to be woven into the very fabric of our cognition and social existence. Studying its structure is, in a way, studying ourselves.
A lot to think about there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the science of language. We hope it's given you a fresh perspective on this amazing thing you use every single day.